For more than 60 million Americans today, one small account quietly shapes almost every financial decision they make. Every paycheck, money disappears into a 401k. It has become so ordinary that most people never stop to ask where it came from. It simply feels like part of American life, as permanent as the dollar itself. But here's something most people have never been told. The 401k didn't even exist until 1978. It wasn't widely used until years later. That means millions of Americans who built this country, including many of your grandparents and even some of your parents, spent most of their working lives in a completely different world. So how did they survive old age? Who paid the bills after they stopped working? Did companies take care of them? Did the government? Or were they simply left on their own? The answer is far more disturbing than most history books ever explain. Because for most of American history, retirement wasn't something people planned for. It wasn't a reward for decades of hard work. It wasn't even considered a normal stage of life. It was a privilege that very few people ever reached. The journey from that harsh reality to the retirement system Americans know today wasn't a carefully designed success story. It was built through economic collapse, political compromise, broken corporate promises, desperate social reforms, and one accidental discovery hidden inside a few forgotten lines of tax law. And perhaps the biggest surprise of all? The retirement system that tens of millions of Americans depend on today may never have been designed to carry the weight it's carrying now. To understand why so many Americans worry about retirement today, we first have to travel back to a time when retirement itself barely existed. Because the first retirement plan in America wasn't a pension, and it certainly wasn't a 401k. For thousands of years, retirement simply wasn't part of human life. People worked for as long as their bodies allowed. Farmers stayed in the fields until their backs gave out. Craftsmen continued making tools until their hands could no longer hold them. Shopkeepers stood behind their counters until illness forced them to stop. And once they could no longer earn a living, there were very few options left. If they had children, they depended on them. If they belonged to a close community, neighbors might help. If neither existed, survival became uncertain. At the beginning of the 20th century, this reality was even more obvious than it sounds today. Around the year 1900, average life expectancy across the world hovered near 30 years. Even in the United States, where living conditions were improving, people lived only into their 40s on average. Many never reached an age where retirement would even become a practical question. Growing old was relatively rare. Growing old without the ability to work was rarer still. That meant society never built institutions around retirement because there was little reason to. But America was changing. During the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution transformed the country faster than almost anyone could have imagined. Farms slowly gave way to factories. Small rural communities evolved into crowded industrial cities. Railroads connected regions that had once seemed impossibly distant. Steel mills, textile plants, coal mines, and manufacturing centers demanded millions of workers. That economic revolution changed far more than the way Americans earned money. It changed the structure of the American family itself. For generations, families had lived and worked together. Parents, children, grandparents, even extended relatives often remained under the same roof or on the same piece of land. Children weren't simply family members, they were part of the household economy. They helped plant crops, raise livestock, repair buildings, and eventually inherited responsibility for aging parents. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always fair. But it created something modern America would slowly lose. A built-in retirement system. As factories expanded, young men and women left their hometowns, searching for wages that farms could never provide. Cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and New York promised opportunity unlike anything earlier generations had known. Millions accepted that promise, but every train heading toward the city carried away something invisible. It separated families that had remained together for centuries. Parents stayed behind. Children moved hundreds of miles away. The old system quietly began to collapse. For the first time in American history, growing old no longer guaranteed that family would be nearby. And once that safety net disappeared, an uncomfortable question emerged. If your children weren't there anymore, who would take care of you? The answer America created would become one of the darkest chapters in its social history. For countless elderly Americans, there was only one place left to go, and almost everyone feared it more than death itself. America's answer wasn't a pension. It wasn't an insurance program. It wasn't even charity in the way most people think about it today. For hundreds of thousands of elderly Americans, the answer was something called the poorhouse. Also known as almshouses, these institutions had existed since colonial times. They were operated by local governments and served one simple purpose: to house anyone who could no longer support themselves. On paper, they sounded practical. In reality, they represented the absolute last stop before complete abandonment. Inside the same buildings lived elderly, people who had outlived their savings, widows with nowhere to go, orphaned children, people with disabilities, the mentally ill, and those suffering from chronic illness. Society didn't separate their needs or circumstances. If you couldn't survive on your own, you were sent to the same place. There was very little privacy, very little comfort, and almost no dignity. Meals were basic, often little more than thin soup and stale bread. Large dormitories replaced family homes. Medical care was limited, and overcrowding was common. For many residents, entering a poorhouse meant accepting that they would probably never leave again. But perhaps the hardest burden wasn't physical. It was psychological. Across America, ending up in a poorhouse became a symbol of personal failure. Entire generations grew up believing that if you worked hard enough, saved enough, and made the right choices, you would never end up there. That belief wasn't entirely true. Many people who entered poorhouses hadn't been lazy. They hadn't wasted their lives. They had simply outlived their income in a society that offered almost no protection against old age. One illness, one workplace injury, one failed harvest, one economic downturn. Any of these could erase decades of hard work. By the late 19th century, the fear of the poorhouse had become so deeply rooted that it entered American literature and popular culture. Stories, poems, and songs described elderly parents making their final journey to these institutions after being unable or sometimes unwilling to rely on their own children. Those stories resonated because they reflected a painful reality. America was becoming wealthier. Its factories produced more steel, more textiles, more machinery, and more consumer goods than ever before. Yet, many of the people who had spent their entire lives building that prosperity found themselves discarded once they could no longer produce. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The country celebrated hard work, but it had no reliable way to reward workers after their labor was over. Ironically, some of the largest poorhouses later evolved into institutions that Americans now associate with healthcare. Places like Bellevue in New York and Cook County in Chicago eventually developed into major public hospitals. But before they became centers of medicine, they had served as warehouses for society's most vulnerable citizens. Over time, reformers managed to move many groups out of the poorhouse. Children were placed in orphanages. The mentally ill were transferred to specialized hospitals. Criminal offenders entered prisons instead. But one group largely remained behind: the elderly. Without family support or personal wealth, they had nowhere else to go. In many ways, the poorhouse became America's first retirement system, not because it was designed to provide comfort, but because society had failed to create anything better. Still, even during those difficult years, a few organizations quietly began experimenting with another idea. What if people pooled their resources while they were still working? What if members supported one another before old age became a crisis? It wasn't yet a national solution, but it planted the first small seed of something that would eventually transform retirement in America forever. The first real alternative didn't come from Washington. It came from private organizations and eventually from one company willing to make a promise no American business had made before. As bleak as the situation looked, America wasn't standing completely still. Long before Washington stepped in, ordinary people began searching for ways to protect one another from the uncertainty of old age. Across the country, fraternal organizations, religious communities, and mutual aid societies quietly built their own safety nets. Irish benevolent associations, German social clubs, Jewish charitable organizations, and groups like the Odd Fellows and the Freemasons all shared a similar idea. If members contributed while they were young and healthy, the organization could help support them when they grew old. It wasn't retirement as we know it today, but it was something revolutionary. For the first time, aging wasn't seen purely as an individual problem. It became a shared responsibility within a community. These organizations established homes where elderly members could receive housing, meals, and care instead of facing the humiliation of the poorhouse. In cities like Brooklyn alone, dozens of these facilities appeared by the end of the 19th century. Religious institutions also joined the effort, providing care to thousands of aging Americans who otherwise had nowhere to turn. For those fortunate enough to belong to these organizations, life after work became a little less frightening. But there was one enormous limitation. These programs only protected their own members. If you weren't connected to the right church, the right community, or the right organization, you were still on your own. America still lacked a nationwide solution. Then, in 1875, something happened that quietly changed the relationship between employers and workers forever. The American Express Company introduced what is widely recognized as the first private corporate pension plan in the United States. Today, American Express is known as a financial giant, but at the time, it was primarily involved in freight transportation connected to the rapidly expanding railroad industry. Its pension program was remarkably generous by 19th century standards. Employees who had worked for the company for at least 20 years reached the required retirement age and received management approval could retire with roughly half of their annual salary, subject to a maximum payment. By modern standards, the amount wasn't large. But the principle behind it was extraordinary. For perhaps the first time, a major American corporation openly acknowledged that its responsibility to employees didn't necessarily end on their final day of work. That idea spread slowly but steadily. As the 20th century approached, some of America's largest companies began adopting similar plans. Industrial giants such as Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, AT&T, and Goodyear all introduced pension programs before 1930. Federal tax policy also encouraged this trend by allowing employer contributions to receive favorable tax treatment. It looked like the beginning of a completely new era. Workers who remained loyal to one company for decades could finally imagine a future that didn't end in poverty. At least, that was the promise. The reality was far more fragile. Despite all the optimism, these pension plans reached only a small fraction of American workers. Even by the early 1930s, the overwhelming majority of employees still had no access to any employer-sponsored retirement plan at all. And those who did often misunderstood one critical fact. These pensions weren't protected by meaningful federal law. Companies weren't required to fully fund the promises they made. They weren't required to place enough money aside for future retirees. In many cases, those promises existed largely on paper. For workers, that distinction was almost invisible. After 20 or 30 years of loyal service, most people naturally believed the pension they had been promised would still be there when retirement finally arrived. Few stopped to ask a simple question. What if the company itself couldn't keep its promise? It was a question that hardly anyone wanted to think about. Soon, millions of Americans would be forced to confront it all at once, not because of corporate greed alone, but because the entire American economy was about to collapse. The greatest economic disaster in modern American history wouldn't just destroy banks and businesses, it would completely redefine what retirement meant for an entire generation. For decades, Americans believed that hard work and personal responsibility would be enough. If you stayed loyal to your employer, saved what you could, and avoided unnecessary debt, old age would eventually take care of itself. Then came 1929. The stock market crash is often remembered as a single catastrophic day on Wall Street. But for ordinary Americans, the real disaster unfolded over the years that followed. Banks failed by the thousand. Businesses disappeared. Factories shut their doors. Entire communities watched their local economies collapse almost overnight. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 American banks closed their doors forever. Millions of depositors lost the savings they had spent decades building. There was no federal deposit insurance. Once a bank failed, life savings often vanished with it. For younger workers, the Depression meant unemployment. For older Americans, it meant something even worse. It meant there was almost no way back. When companies began laying off workers, older employees were usually among the first to lose their jobs. Employers preferred younger workers who could accept lower wages and perform physically demanding work. Those approaching retirement suddenly found themselves unemployed at exactly the moment they needed stable income the most. Finding another job was nearly impossible. Living off savings became impossible, and relying on family wasn't much easier. Their children were facing the same economic catastrophe. Entire households struggled just to put food on the table. The traditional safety net that had supported families for generations collapsed under the weight of the Depression. As poverty spread across the country, the poorhouses that many Americans had hoped were disappearing began filling once again. The nightmare people thought belonged to another century suddenly returned. Only now, it affected millions. By the mid-1930s, roughly half of America's elderly population could no longer support themselves financially. Many had done everything society had asked of them. They had worked hard, saved carefully, and lived responsibly. Yet they still found themselves with nothing. The Depression exposed a painful truth that could no longer be ignored. Old age wasn't simply a personal responsibility. It had become a national problem. Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood this better than most political leaders of his time. He recognized that modern industrial economies could no longer depend solely on families, charities, or private companies to care for aging workers. America needed something permanent, something that wouldn't disappear every time the economy entered another crisis. On the 14th of August, 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. It became one of the most important turning points in American social history. For the first time, the federal government accepted long-term responsibility for helping workers survive old age. Instead of relying entirely on family support or employer generosity, Americans would contribute through payroll taxes during their working years and receive monthly benefits after retirement. The payments weren't generous. They were never intended to replace a full salary. In fact, the earliest monthly benefits were remarkably small, and many categories of workers, including agricultural laborers, domestic workers, and the self-employed, were initially excluded from the program. But something far more important had changed. For the first time, elderly Americans received something they had almost never possessed before. A guarantee, not a guarantee of wealth, not a guarantee of comfort, but a guarantee that growing old no longer had to end in complete destitution. The psychological impact was enormous. People finally believed the federal government would not simply abandon them once they could no longer work. Yet Roosevelt never imagined Social Security would carry the entire burden of retirement. In his vision, it was only one part of a much larger system. And for a few decades, that system appeared to work almost perfect. After World War II, millions of Americans began believing they'd finally solved the retirement problem. But beneath that golden age, a dangerous weakness was quietly growing, and one company would expose it to the entire nation. For a generation of American workers, it finally seemed as though retirement had been solved. The decades following World War II were unlike anything the country had experienced before. Factories expanded, production soared, wages climbed, unions gained influence. America's manufacturing giants competed aggressively for skilled workers, and one of the most powerful recruiting tools wasn't a higher paycheck. It was the promise of a secure retirement. If you spent 30 years working for the same company, you could reasonably expect something your parents had rarely known: a monthly pension check. Combined with Social Security, it offered something that had once seemed almost impossible: a future where old age didn't automatically mean poverty. This was the era that shaped America's modern image of retirement, the farewell celebration after decades of loyal service. The gold watch presented on the final day, the quiet lakeside cabin, the garden that finally had time to grow. For millions of Americans, those images weren't advertisements. They were reality. Loyalty had become a long-term investment. Work hard. Stay with one company. Retire comfortably. Simple, or so it appeared. Hidden beneath that prosperity was a weakness almost nobody outside corporate boardrooms understood. Many pension plans were built on promises rather than actual money. Companies pledged future benefits to employees, but in many cases, they weren't setting aside enough funds to pay those promises decades later. As long as business remained strong, few people noticed. Nobody wanted to ask difficult questions while the economy was booming. But retirement systems aren't tested during good times. They're tested when companies begin to fail. That moment arrived in the early 1960s. One of America's oldest automobile manufacturers, Studebaker, had once been an industrial success story. The company traced its roots back to the 19th century, first producing wagons before becoming a respected automobile manufacturer. For decades, Studebaker represented American craftsmanship, but by the early 1960s, the company could no longer compete with Detroit's Big Three. Sales declined, losses mounted, debt grew. Eventually, the business reached its breaking point. In December 1963, Studebaker closed its major production plant in South Bend, Indiana. Thousands of workers suddenly lost more than their jobs. They lost the future they believed had already been earned. Around 10,500 workers depended on the company's pension plan. Some retirees who had already begun receiving benefits were protected because annuities had previously been purchased for them. But thousands of others weren't nearly as fortunate. Workers in their 40s and 50s, people who had devoted more than 2 decades to the company, received only a small fraction of the pensions they had been promised. Many recovered barely 15 cents for every dollar they expected. Others received nothing at all. Imagine spending 23 years working toward retirement, only to discover that most of what you had counted on simply didn't exist. Not because you failed, not because you made reckless financial decisions, but because the company never fully funded the promises it made. The shock spread far beyond South Bend. Studebaker exposed something millions of Americans had never realized. A pension wasn't automatically guaranteed. It depended entirely on whether the company remained financially healthy and whether it had actually saved enough money to honor its commitments. For decades, workers had assumed pensions were as reliable as salaries. Studebaker shattered that illusion almost overnight. Even more alarming, the disaster wasn't unique. Similar failures were quietly occurring in steel, textiles, manufacturing, and other industries across the country. Workers who had sacrificed their entire careers for the promise of retirement discovered there was almost no legal protection if those promises disappeared. America had finally escaped the poorhouse, but now another fear was taking its place. What happens when the company you've trusted your entire life can no longer afford to keep its word? Washington could no longer ignore that question. Eventually, Congress decided it had to act. But the law that was meant to save pensions would end up changing the entire retirement system in ways almost no one could have predicted. The next law was designed to protect American workers, but it would also create the perfect conditions for pensions to slowly disappear. The collapse of Studebaker didn't just devastate thousands of workers, it shattered one of the biggest assumptions in corporate America. For years, employees believed a pension promise was as solid as the company itself. Now, they understood something far more unsettling. A pension was only as secure as the balance sheet behind it. The public demanded answers. Labor unions demanded reform. Even lawmakers who had largely ignored pension issues could no longer pretend the problem was isolated. If one major company could fail this spectacularly, how many others were sitting on the same hidden weakness? The answer was deeply uncomfortable. Studebaker wasn't the exception. It was simply the first company to expose the problem on a national stage. Across industries from steel and manufacturing to textiles and transportation, many employers had promised retirement benefits without setting aside enough money to actually pay them decades later. As long as business remained profitable, the illusion survived. But when companies struggled, the promises disappeared. Congress spent years debating how to fix the system. The discussions moved painfully slowly. Business groups warned that strict regulations would become expensive. Labor organizations argued that without federal protection, millions of workers would continue risking their entire retirement on corporate promises that might never be honored. Meanwhile, another series of pension scandals kept making headlines. Public confidence continued to erode. Eventually, Washington reached a conclusion. Retirement promises could no longer rely solely on trust. They needed the force of law. On the 2nd of September 1974, Labor Day President Gerald Ford signed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, better known as ERISA. At the time, many Americans viewed it as the long-awaited solution, and in many ways, it was. ERISA established clear rules that companies had never been required to follow before. Employers now had to fund pension plans more responsibly. Workers gained legal rights that simply hadn't existed. Companies had to provide clearer information about retirement benefits instead of hiding behind vague promises. Perhaps most importantly, ERISA created the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, or PBGC. Think of it as an insurance system for traditional pensions. If a company went bankrupt and couldn't pay retirees what it had promised, the PBGC would step in and guarantee a significant portion of those benefits. For millions of workers, this was revolutionary. For the first time, retirement security no longer depended entirely on the financial health of a single employer. It seemed as though America had finally solved the weakness exposed by Studebaker, but history has a habit of producing unintended consequences. The very rules that made pensions safer also made them far more expensive. Funding requirements became stricter. Administrative costs increased. Compliance grew more complicated. Large corporations could absorb those costs. Many smaller employers couldn't. Even companies that could afford traditional pensions began asking a different question. Why continue carrying decades of financial risk if another option existed? Executives started searching for retirement plans that would cost less, require less long-term commitment, and shift uncertainty away from the company itself. Without realizing it, ERISA had changed the incentives. For decades, employers accepted most of the investment risk. If markets performed poorly, the company absorbed the losses. If retirees lived longer than expected, the company paid the difference. Everything rested on the employer. After ERISA, that responsibility looked increasingly expensive. Corporate America wasn't trying to eliminate retirement benefits altogether. It was searching for a different model, one that offered retirement savings without requiring companies to guarantee retirement income. That alternative didn't emerge from Congress. It didn't come from the White House. And it wasn't the result of years of public debate. Instead, it appeared almost by accident, hidden inside a small section of federal tax law that almost nobody noticed when it was passed. A page and a half of legal language, written for an entirely different purpose, was about to reshape retirement in America more dramatically than anyone could have imagined. Ironically, the retirement revolution that transformed America wasn't planned by presidents or economists. It began with one consultant reading a forgotten section of the tax code on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. By the late 1970s, corporate America was searching for a new direction. Traditional pensions had become increasingly expensive. Companies were facing stricter regulations. Long-term liabilities were growing. Every promise they made to workers represented another financial obligation stretching decades into the future. Many executives wanted a different approach. They just didn't know where to find one. Ironically, the answer had already been written into federal law. Almost no one noticed. In 1978, Congress passed the Revenue Act, a massive piece of tax legislation containing hundreds of provisions. Buried deep inside that enormous document was a short section of the Internal Revenue Code known simply as Section 401K. It occupied barely a page and a half. There were no dramatic debates on television. No newspaper headlines declared it revolutionary. No senator stood before the nation predicting it would redefine retirement. To lawmakers, it was merely another technical adjustment within an already enormous tax bill. Its original purpose was surprisingly narrow. Congress wasn't trying to redesign retirement for ordinary Americans. The provision was intended to clarify how certain deferred compensation arrangements for corporate executives should be taxed. Nothing more. For nearly 2 years, almost nothing happened. The law quietly sat in the tax code, ignored, unnoticed, waiting for someone to see possibilities its own authors had never imagined. That person appeared in 1979. His name was Ted Benna. Benna wasn't a famous politician. He wasn't an economist. He wasn't running a Wall Street investment bank. He was a benefits consultant working with companies to design employee retirement programs. One Saturday afternoon, while reviewing the tax code for a banking client, Benna noticed Section 401K. Most people would have read past it. He didn't. As he studied the language, one idea kept returning. The law never explicitly said that only executives could benefit from these tax advantages. And just as importantly, it never explicitly said ordinary employees couldn't. That tiny gap in the wording changed everything. Benna realized companies might allow workers to contribute part of their own salaries into retirement accounts before taxes were deducted. Even more importantly, employers could encourage participation by matching part of those contributions. It was a bold interpretation. Even Benna later admitted it pushed the boundaries of what lawmakers had originally intended. His first client wasn't convinced. Executives worried the Internal Revenue Service would eventually reject the idea and declare the entire arrangement illegal. Rather than abandon it, Benna did something unexpected. He implemented the plan inside his own company. In doing so, he created what is widely recognized as America's first true 401k retirement plan. The idea spread quickly through professional networks. Benna shared his interpretation with Treasury officials and retirement specialists, helping shape the regulations that would eventually govern these new plans. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1981, the IRS officially approved regulations recognizing the 401k as a legitimate retirement savings vehicle funded through payroll deductions. Suddenly, what had been one consultant's creative reading of the tax code became national policy. Corporate America moved with astonishing speed. Companies that had spent years worrying about the rising cost of traditional pensions suddenly saw an alternative. Employees could build retirement savings. Employers could still contribute matching funds. But unlike traditional pensions, companies no longer had to guarantee a fixed monthly income for life. The financial risk looked dramatically different. Major corporations quickly embraced the new model. Johnson & Johnson, PepsiCo, Honeywell, and many others rushed to establish their own 401k plans. The financial industry recognized the opportunity almost immediately. Mutual fund companies designed entirely new investment products. Brokerage firms expanded retirement services. Insurance companies entered the market. Wall Street had discovered something extraordinary, not just another financial product, but an entirely new river of long-term investment capital flowing into the markets every single payday. What began as a forgotten paragraph inside a tax bill was becoming one of the largest financial systems in American history. To millions of workers, it looked like progress. More freedom, more control, more ownership over their own future. And in many ways, it truly was. But beneath those advantages lay a fundamental shift that almost nobody fully understood. The retirement money was still there. The retirement risk was quietly moving somewhere else. The biggest change wasn't that Americans started saving differently. It was that corporations quietly stopped carrying the responsibility they had once promised to bear. At first, the rise of the 401k looked like a victory for everyone. Employees gained more control over their retirement savings. Companies still offered matching contributions. Investment choices expanded every year, and millions of Americans felt empowered to build their own financial future. On the surface, it seemed like the retirement system had finally entered the modern age. But beneath that optimism, something much larger was happening. Something so gradual that most workers never noticed it until years later. Traditional pensions began disappearing. Not overnight, not through one law, not because Congress voted to eliminate. They simply faded away, one company at a time. For employers, the decision made perfect financial sense. A traditional pension is what economists call a defined benefit plan. The company promises a specific monthly payment after retirement, regardless of what happens in the stock market. If investments perform poorly, the company absorbs the loss. If retirees live longer than expected, the company pays for those extra years. If inflation rises, the employer still carries the obligation. The risk always stays with the company. A 401k works very differently. It's a defined contribution plan. The employer contributes a certain amount, often by matching part of the employee's own savings, but once that money enters the account, the company's responsibility is essentially over. From that moment forward, almost everything depends on the worker. If the market performs well, your retirement account grows. If the market crashes, your balance shrinks. If you invest wisely, you benefit. If you make poor decisions, you bear the consequences. For corporations, this wasn't just another retirement plan. It fundamentally changed the balance of responsibility. The financial uncertainty that companies had carried for decades was quietly transferred onto individual workers. Most employees didn't see that shift happening. After all, every month they still received retirement statements. Their employers still advertised retirement benefits. Everything looked familiar, but the promise had changed. Under the old system, employers promised an outcome. Under the new system, they promised only an opportunity. That distinction would shape the financial lives of millions of Americans. As the years passed, more and more businesses abandoned traditional pensions altogether. The numbers tell the story clearly. By the mid-1970s, Defined benefit pension plans covered tens of millions of private sector workers. Over the following decades, participation steadily declined. At the same time, defined contribution plans, especially 401ks, expanded dramatically, eventually reaching more than 80 million participants. The transformation was one of the largest shifts in American financial history. Wall Street recognized its significance almost immediately. Every paycheck flowing into a 401k represented long-term investment capital. Mutual funds multiplied. Retirement investment products exploded. Asset management firms grew into financial giants. Whether workers earned exceptional returns or disappointing ones, management fees continued flowing into the financial industry year after year. Even Ted Benna, the consultant whose interpretation helped launch the modern 401k, eventually became one of its most outspoken critics. He repeatedly argued that the system had drifted far beyond its original purpose. In his view, the 401k was never meant to replace traditional pensions. It was designed to supplement them. Instead, many employers used it as a substitute. Benna also criticized the growing complexity of retirement investing and the high fees that quietly reduced workers' long-term savings. His concern wasn't that Americans were saving. It was that millions of ordinary people were now expected to make sophisticated financial decisions that previous generations had never been asked to make. The retirement system had become more flexible, but it had also become far more dependent on individual knowledge, discipline, and luck. And that raised a difficult question. What happens to the millions of people who can't afford to save enough, who don't understand financial markets, or who simply experience bad timing when retirement finally arrives? That question is no longer theoretical. It's the reality facing millions of Americans today. After more than a century of reforms, America may have escaped the poorhouse, but has it really escaped the fear that created it? Or has that fear simply taken on a new form? After more than a century of reforms, legislation, and financial innovation, you might expect America's retirement problem to have finally been solved. Instead, many experts argue that it has simply changed its appearance. Today's retirees no longer fear being sent to a poorhouse, but many fear something that feels remarkably similar. Running out of money before they run out of life. That anxiety isn't limited to a small group of people. It's becoming increasingly common across the country. According to retirement research, a significant share of Americans approaching retirement have little or no retirement savings at all. While average account balances often appear encouraging, those averages hide an uncomfortable reality. A relatively small number of wealthy households hold very large retirement accounts. Millions of others have far less than they need. Some have saved only a few $1,000s after decades of work. Others have nothing at all. The gap between those two groups continues to grow. For workers fortunate enough to spend their careers with generous employers, invest consistently, and retire during strong financial markets, the 401k can be an extraordinary wealth-building tool. But retirement systems should never be judged only by their best outcomes. They should also be judged by what happens to ordinary people. What happens to workers whose wages barely cover daily expenses? What happens to families forced to choose between paying today's bills and saving for a retirement 30 years away? What happens when someone loses a job during a recession, stops contributing for several years, and watches decades of compound growth disappear? The modern retirement system often assumes that everyone has the same opportunities. Reality says otherwise. A 401k rewards consistency. But life is rarely consistent. Medical emergencies happen. Divorces happen. Economic recessions happen. Unexpected layoffs happen. Entire industries disappear. Each interruption leaves a permanent mark on retirement savings. Then there's another challenge: investment knowledge. Previous generations didn't need to understand mutual funds, index funds, target date funds, asset allocation, or portfolio diversification. Today's workers are expected to navigate all of those decisions themselves, choosing the wrong investments, paying excessive management fees, reacting emotionally during market crashes, retiring just after a major downturn. Any one of those decisions can permanently reduce retirement income. The responsibility that once belonged largely to employers has increasingly shifted onto individuals. Social Security still provides an essential foundation for millions of retirees. In fact, it continues lifting millions of older Americans above the poverty line every year. but it was never intended to replace an entire paycheck. It was designed to provide a minimum level of security, not complete financial independence. Meanwhile, debates over the long-term future of Social Security continue to surface almost every election cycle. Questions about funding, eligibility ages, benefit levels, and long-term sustainability have become regular features of American political life. Whether major changes eventually occur or not, the uncertainty itself creates another layer of anxiety for workers trying to plan decades into the future. Looking back across this entire history, a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. Every generation believed it had found the solution. The poorhouse gave way to company pensions. Company pensions gave way to Social Security. Social Security was supplemented by the 401k. Each transition promised greater security, greater freedom, greater stability, and each genuinely improved life for millions of Americans. Yet every solution also introduced a new vulnerability that only became visible years later. History rarely repeats itself in exactly the same way. More often, it repeats the same questions, while changing the answers. And perhaps no question has remained more persistent than this one. When you can no longer work, who should carry the burden of your future? The answer to that question may be the most revealing lesson in the entire history of American retirement. When you step back and look at this story as a whole, something remarkable becomes clear. The history of retirement in America isn't really the history of pensions. It isn't the history of Social Security. And it isn't even the history of the 401k. It's the history of one question that every generation has been forced to answer in its own way. Who should bear the risk of growing old? For most of American history, that burden rested almost entirely on individuals and their families. If you couldn't work, you depended on your children. If your family couldn't help, you depended on charity. And if charity failed, you often ended up in the poorhouse. Then, for a brief period during the 20th century, that burden was shared. Employers accepted part of the responsibility through traditional pensions. The federal government accepted another part through Social Security. For a while, it appeared that America had finally found a balance. But history rarely stands still. Over the past several decades, that balance has shifted once again. Much of the responsibility has gradually returned to individuals. Today, millions of Americans are expected to make investment decisions, predict future market performance, calculate how long they'll live, estimate future healthcare costs, and save enough money to support themselves for decades after leaving the workforce. That's an enormous responsibility, one that previous generations were never expected to carry alone. None of this means the 401k is a failure. For disciplined savers, it has created extraordinary opportunities. For many families, it has generated life-changing wealth. But it was never designed to become the foundation of America's retirement system. Even the people who helped create it have openly admitted that. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson hidden inside this entire story. The retirement system millions of Americans depend on today wasn't built from one master plan. It evolved through economic crises, political compromises, corporate decisions, unexpected consequences, and one remarkably creative interpretation of a few forgotten lines in the tax code. History reminds us that institutions don't stay the same forever. They evolve, sometimes intentional, sometimes by accident, and sometimes because no one realizes how much has changed until decades later. The question now is whether America's next retirement system is already beginning to take shape, just as quietly as the last one did. If this story changed the way you think about retirement, or made you realize that the system we depend on today is far younger and far more fragile than it appears, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think retirement should primarily be an individual responsibility? Or should employers and governments play a larger role in protecting people after a lifetime of work? Leave your perspective in the comments below. Some of the most thoughtful discussions happen there, and I genuinely like to know where you stand. If you enjoy documentaries that go beyond the headlines to explore the hidden history behind money, power, and the institutions that shape our lives, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next story. Because history isn't just about understanding the past. It's often the clearest way to understand what's coming next.